Welcome to Day 9 of the Charleston Literary Festival. I know, it's amazing. My name is Suzanne Pollack, and I am the Development Director and the Party Planner for the festival. I want to thank this session's sponsors, Bonnie and Peter McCausland and the McCausland Foundation. It is my, we love our donors. It is my pleasure to introduce Jyoti Thottam and Adam Shoemaker. Jyoti was born in India to one of the amazing nurses she writes about in Sisters of Mokama, the story of 6 intrepid nuns from Appalachia and their young Indian trainee nurses who established a hospital in one of the poorest regions in India. Jyoti grew up in Texas and graduated from Yale and Columbia. She is currently a senior opinion editor of the New York Times. Before joining the New York Times, she was a business reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at Time magazine, and worked as a news editor at Al Jazeera America. Her work includes award-winning stories about the Ganges River and Mumbai terrorist attacks. She is in Charleston this weekend with her 2 sisters celebrating a big birthday. Adam Shoemaker, not hers. Adam Shoemaker is the rector of St. Stephen's Church, a 200-year-old, you have a lot of fans here. St. Stephen's is a 200-year-old inclusive Episcopal church a few blocks from here, which I attend. Adam may be, okay, well, I don't have that much more to say, but Adam may be the only Episcopal priest in the United States that has a Muslim father and a Jewish mother. And he is an unbelievably wonderful man. His inspiring sermons invariably lift me up all week long, and they stay with me for the entire week. And I think he's the perfect interlocutor for Jyoti. Thank you. Thank you. Have fun.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and welcome to this afternoon's conversation. Before we get started, I just want to let you know about the flow of this coming hour. Jyoti will begin by giving us a synopsis, an overview of the book so we can have some context. Then the 2 of us will have some conversation. And about 15 minutes till the end of our time, we will open things up for questions from the audience. But with that, Jyoti, thank you so very much for joining us, and please tell us about the book.
All right, I will. Okay, I'll stand at the podium for this part. Suzanne gave such a great overview. I thought the best way for me to start this book would be to just read a little bit from it. And I have to say also thank you to all of you. Charleston is such a beautiful city, and the history is just like in every brick, every street. So I hope this is a crowd of history lovers, because I certainly am. So I just want to start with, I think, the moment when I really felt that this story was more than just a family story, that it was a story that had so many layers that it just had to be a book. And it was the interview that I did with the youngest of the nuns who went on this amazing journey to India to start a missionary hospital. Her name was Anne Roberta Powers, but I was very lucky to be able to interview her before she passed away. So I'll just start with Anne Roberta. Anne Roberta was only 22 when she left America in 1947. She had not even taken her final vows, the last step in making a lifetime commitment to religious life. And the 2-month journey from Kentucky to India by ship and cross-country train was the adventure of a lifetime. She recited the dates and details as if she had stepped off the ship only days earlier. She told me about the first months of setting up the hospital, scrounging for supplies, improvising beds and bandages, planting a garden and learning to bargain for vegetables in Hindi with merchants in the bazaar. I asked her what kind of patients they would get in those early days, and she immediately recalled the orphans. This was in the first years after the traumatic partition that split the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. 12 million people left their homes, fleeing violence or taking a chance on a new life on the other side of the newly drawn borders. So families were scattered in every direction. She told me about one little girl who was brought to the hospital from the train station at Mokama by the railway police. She was still a toddler, well-fed and beautiful. That in itself was unusual. Most of the orphans who landed at Nazareth Hospital arrived malnourished and sick. But this girl had been traveling with her mother on a train from Delhi to Calcutta. About halfway through the journey, as the train halted at a station in the middle of the night, the mother told the other people in the compartment that she wanted to get some more milk for her child. Would they mind keeping an eye on her while she slept? The mother never came back. The other passengers thought that she must have boarded in a different car and would walk back to her berth. But when the train reached the next station, Mokama, she still had not returned. They called the railway police, who brought the abandoned child to the convent. The nuns carried her inside to examine her. She was lethargic, perhaps drugged, but otherwise healthy. She wore a diaper, a soft, store-bought one, a luxury at the time. The nuns began to undress her to put her to bed and discovered that she was wearing 6 frilly dresses, one on top of the other. They must have been all the clothing she owned in the world. Anne Roberta paused for a moment over that detail, so stunning in its tenderness and cruelty. It was St. Bernard's Day, so they called her Marie Bernadette. That was the moment I felt that there was more to the story of Nazareth Hospital than I had imagined. It was built out of the ashes of partition, a place where those who had escaped or endured the ruptures of home and community would learn to look at this new and brutal world for what it was. When you could no longer count on anyone to protect you, where would you go? What would you do? Who would you be? What kind of place was India in 1947, where a woman might lovingly prepare her own child to be abandoned? There were thousands of such children in India at that time, orphans whose parents had been killed in the months of violence, and others who were left behind in the great rush of people fleeing from one place to the other. This girl didn't look like a refugee. She could have been the child of a marriage between a Hindu and a Muslim. During partition, the lines between communities hardened. Parents and children, husbands and wives were sometimes forced to choose between one country and the other. She could have been the product of rape. There were thousands of women on both sides of the border who suffered sexual violence, and it took many months for the governments of India and Pakistan to decide the fate of their children. There were also thousands of husbands who went off to fight or to find their fortunes on the other side of the partition line, and it was not uncommon for months to pass without their sending word back to their wives. Had the child's mother been one of those wives who took a lover to fill the silence? Or perhaps she had simply decided to seize that moment when the whole world was in chaos, to choose a different life for herself. Another city, another name, another destiny, one that she would choose for herself. In many ways, all the women of Nazareth, the sisters like Anne Roberta, who left their homes in Kentucky to go to India, and the young women like my mother, who left their villages to study nursing, were animated by that same impulse. The years after World War II in the United States and the years after partition in India were, in one important way, the same. They were years of tumult and trauma, when those whose lives had been constrained by an old order found themselves suddenly free when that order was destroyed. Pain and loss were everywhere for women of that time, but what looked like a vacuum was, for some women, an opening, a chance to create for themselves lives that would never have been possible otherwise. So I'll just stop there. I know Adam has lots of questions, and I'm looking forward to talking with all of you.
Jyoti, you and I have something in common in that we share inspiring, intrepid mothers. And the experience that my mother had as a young woman living in Egypt has been a thread that I have continued to sort of pull as I've explored my own identity and my own background. You say a little bit about this in the book, but I wonder if you could talk to begin with about what inspired you to write this book at this time, and what was your process? Because as I read the book, all the character development and the convent in Kentucky and the hospital in India, you know, I wondered how you went about putting this book together.
Well, thank you, Adam. And, you know, as a writer, I love talking about my process. I could spend a whole hour doing that. But, you know, your first question about the family story, I think is a really interesting one. I mean, and I know we'll get to your family story in a little bit, which is also fascinating. So this definitely did start for me as one of those family stories. I mean, like many people, I would ask my parents, you know, how did we come to the United States? How did we get here? And my mother would sort of tell this what seemed like a very simple story. You know, well, I went to nursing school. It was a school run by nuns from Kentucky, and then I became a nurse, and I came to the United States, and we lived happily ever after. So, you know, as a child, I just sort of took for granted, like, okay, well, I guess that's how we got here. But when I became older and really started to, you know, peel back some of the layers of that family story and ask more questions, I mean, why did my mother, I mean, the nursing school was so far away from where she grew up, might as well have been in a different country. How did these women from Kentucky get to this small town in India? I mean, it was just a mystery to me. And then as a reporter, when I actually went to that area and saw like, oh wow, this isn't just any place in India. I mean, this is really, even people in India, if you tell them you're going to Bihar, they're sort of like, oh my gosh, why would you ever go there? It's really one of those extremely difficult places. So trying to, I think, understand really what was underneath, what seemed like, well, these are just my parents, this is how they got here. That was the beginning of it. And it really took many years for me to understand that it wasn't just an unusual story in my own family, which of course it was, and I think every one of us has, you know, some version of that in our own families, you know, the aunt, or, you know, maybe it is your parents, but someone who's done something really unusual or gone on an amazing adventure. But it's when I started to see all the pieces of it, what was going on in Kentucky at that time. I mean, for me, I thought it was really a partition story. I mean, they arrived in 1947, like right after this very dramatic split. But to understand that, I really had to understand what was going on in the United States at the end of World War II. I mean, that's really, I think, what drove a lot of these women. So the process, what I thought would be just me talking to my mother, her classmates, people who had worked at the hospital, who knew that area, it became so much broader. And I really sort of got into digging into archives, especially the archive of the convent in Kentucky is just an amazing place. And that was probably like the most difficult part of the research. I don't know how deeply I should go into this, but I mean, it was really one of the most moving parts of the research itself, because, you know, these are nuns, these are religious women. They live in some ways very private lives, although they've always worked in schools and hospitals in Kentucky and elsewhere. But when I heard that they had this archive, they'd kept records of everything that happened, they wrote letters home. In fact, there was like a record day by day of those first early days. And I asked to see them. The leadership of the order initially they were very friendly and very helpful in other ways, but they said, oh, no, we've never made that available to anyone outside the order except in a few people doing family history, genealogy. So I kept asking, I'm a reporter, I'm, sort of trying to be persistent without being too annoying, but, I would send these sort of polite letters every few weeks, call them. And finally, I just got on a plane and I flew to Kentucky to make my request in person. And eventually the president of the order at that time agreed. And what she said to me was, I realized that this story wasn't just significant to the history of our order or even to Catholic history, but this was a story that was significant for women's history. And if we didn't make this available, then the amazing things that these women had done would just be lost to history. So that really, I felt this incredible sense of responsibility to do justice to it.
My mother wrote a lot of letters home when she was living in Cairo and Luxor in the 1970s that are, just a treasure trove for me personally to be able to consider what my mother's experiences were as a 20-something living in that part of the world. I wonder, in the writing of this book, did your mother, write during that time? Were there photographs, were there resources that she was able to provide you in putting this story together?
Mm-hmm. There were some. I mean, I spoke to her a few times. I spoke to some of her classmates. She definitely has some photographs which she's shared with me. I mean, it's always just amazing to see photographs of your parents before they were your parents. I mean, that was really moving, and one of the places where I started the book. Although, interestingly, what I quickly realized as I was doing the research, and you might as well, I couldn't rely only on, my mother to tell that story. I mean, not because she couldn't. I mean, she does, she's happily told me lots of her stories, but she was only 15 when she left home to go to nursing. So her perspective on everything that was happening was a perspective of a very young woman who's leaving home for the first time. Everything is sort of strange. She's just sort of trying to make her way in all of this, as all of the young women were. So she didn't necessarily know, who were the sisters, like what had brought them. I mean, those were not the questions that she was asking herself. So to discover that, I had to really sort of go in a completely different direction.
As you read this book, it's really clear how arduous the experience was of setting up this mission for all the women who are involved in it. And you allude in the introduction to something of the motivation that led these women to do this. And you argue towards the end of the book that you see similarities in what drew the nuns from Kentucky to go to India, as well as the nurses from India who ultimately had the experience there. You write in their letters and in their own words, the women of Nazareth were clear, although not always explicit, about what motivated them. It was ambition and longing, passion and hunger. Not for what they would find in Mokama, they knew so little about the world they would enter, but for something more than what they had. These words are not often used to describe women in religious communities in mid-century America or teenagers growing up on rubber plantations in southern India, but they are the only ones equal to this story. It was this desire, more than economic exigency or religious fervor, that brought them to Mokama. And it was desire that allowed them to endure and thrive in a harsh and unforgiving place. I wonder if you could say more about what you felt drove the women who were part of this hospital.
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think when I was trying to answer for myself, really, what motivated all of these women, but also how did they just keep going, day after day? I mean, that was really the only answer that I could come up with, but also those are the ideas, the feelings that come through when I was reading their words. I mean, it was in their own words, like the letters these women were writing home. I mean, that spirit just sort of came through on every page. Like they were not, of course they would describe things that happened, the difficulties, but I have to be honest, I mean, they were having the adventure of a lifetime. I mean, this was, for them, I mean, being a missionary was like the hardest, toughest job that you could do as a woman in religious life. And they were completely up for that. I mean, that's what they wanted to do. That's what they wanted to spend their lives doing. And so every challenge, it was like, okay, how are we gonna make this happen? I mean, they would occasionally get discouraged, but I don't know. It was like there was no option of turning back. I mean, they had really. Once they got on that ship to go to India, I mean, they were told when they were leaving, okay, you have 3 weeks to see your families, because the assumption at that time was say goodbye forever because you probably won't see them again. That's what it meant to be a missionary at that time. So they knew what they were getting into, and they just embraced that. And in a way, I think for my mother and all these women who left homes, I mean, left very small villages to go and become nurses, it's that first step, it's that first leaving home that's really the hardest part. I mean, once you have left your village or small town, I mean, I'm sure some of you have maybe grown up in very small towns. Once you've left that behind, you're really like, you're never the same person again. And you just keep moving, and that's what I saw in all of these women, and in their stories. Like once they had left home, they were always going forward. I mean, it was true for my mother and so many of her classmates. Once they left their village and went to this nursing school, okay, well then why not go to a big city like Delhi or Bombay? I mean, why not? They'd already done the hardest part, and once you've done that, well, why not go to the United States to make a life there? And my parents landed in New York. We were there for a few years. Once you've done that, well, why not go to the suburbs of Texas? I mean, which is how much harder could it be, right?
Right.
So that's where I grew up. So for them, I mean, it was really something was motivating them, and in a way, the book is a process of figuring that out.
Well, and it seems like there was just wonderful dynamism that came about when these women met in this hospital. And as somebody who served my church as a missionary in a very poor area of Brazil, I resonate deeply with a lot of what you write in the book about the challenge of trying to make it in a foreign context, the power dynamic that is at play when somebody who is an American tries to go to another part of the world, particularly an impoverished part of the world. These nuns were ministering during a changing time, a changing culture, both in the church and in the world. There was great change happening in India. And really, for me, what bubbles to the surface as a priest and former missionary is, what does it mean to be a missionary in a decolonized world? I struggled mightily with calling myself a missionary before I left for Brazil, because of the weight, the colonial weight of what has come along with that word. I had the word missionary stamped into my passport. I was introduced in Brazil frequently as a missionary, but I often wondered, what am I doing here? What is the mission? And I think that clearly, on one level, the mission was setting up this hospital. But it seems like it was so much more than that. You write in the conclusion of the book, the hospital was not simply a place where Americans gave and Indians received. The Americans at Nazareth Hospital approached everything they did with a radical openness, a willingness to allow themselves to be changed by India and by every human being they encountered, especially the young women who joined them as nurses and sisters. Their presence forced them to confront, even before the historic changes of Vatican II, some profound questions about what they were doing and why. Why had they come to India? What could they really do for the people of Mokama, and how would they do it? And I wonder if you could say a little bit about, what you really felt like the mission was, the work of this synergy that happened when these women from different cultures and different parts of the world, came together and met in this place and at this hospital.
Mm-hmm. I feel like that's such a great way of thinking about it, like what is the mission, I feel like we should maybe always be asking ourselves that question, like what is the mission really? I think that, when they started, it seemed so obvious what they were doing. I mean, this was a place that had no hospital of any kind. I mean, no doctors, no nurses, nothing. And there was a truly great need, but also a desire on the part of people in that community for a hospital. Like they knew the people need a hospital. We have the skills. It's a whole story of why this particular community went there to build the hospital. But that part seemed very obvious. So they were very focused on just building the hospital, just doing what they came there to do. But what is so interesting about them, and even today, they don't think of themselves as, well, we're here to run a hospital. I mean, in fact, and this amazed me sometimes in speaking to them more recently, they're very open to the idea that, maybe a hospital is not really what this community needs now. I mean, if there are other hospitals in the area, maybe it's not a hospital anymore, and that's okay. Like there are other needs in the community that they're more than willing to meet. But they had that sense of openness, and this is what amazed me, really from the beginning, because I think because they came to it with so few preconceptions about what they would be doing or what they would find, that whenever they encountered people who would really challenge them, particularly these young women, and there was absolutely conflict and confrontation. I mean, it was not always an easy process, but they could see that, these women are sort of challenging us to really ask ourselves, again, what is the mission? Why are we here? So as they're kind of going through this process of, well, what does the hospital need? Well, the hospital needs nurses. There are not nearly enough nurses in India. We just have to train them ourselves. Okay, we're going to start a nursing school. Mm-hmm. And so, all right, what does the nursing school need? It needs young women. Mm-hmm. So then they went and found women who wanted to do this. And then it was a question of, well, what do these young women need? And these women needed something that was really very different from what the nuns started with, but they were willing to change and make it possible. And ultimately, I think that sense of possibility of creating not only just a physical hospital, but creating an opportunity for themselves to do good in that place, but also creating an opportunity for these women, that ultimately has ended up being probably the most meaningful legacy. And I guess in a sense, you don't really know the real mission until you've done it. But if you were to ask me, I feel like that was the real mission, to just create this sense of possibility in a place and for a group of people who didn't have that before.
Well, and what's interesting, you talk about how the experience of sort of leaving the village broadened the horizons of women like your mother. but it feels like for the American nuns, they found a new home in Mokama. And a lot of them chose to stay there to the end of their lives. Some of them are buried right there by the hospital. So I think it feels to me like there was great personal transformation for some of those women, certainly for those nuns who they left behind all that they had known, and through those years of labor and innovation and creativity and conflict and tension, they discovered themselves in a new way, a profound way.
They really did. I mean, Anne Roberta is absolutely like that. I mean, when I met her, she was in her 80s. She had retired from active work as a teacher, or I mean, she worked in so many missions in India over the course of her life. But she was after she retired, but before I met her, she told me, she had made this this journey back to Kentucky. I mean, she still had sisters who were living. She had so many, she had nieces, nephews, I mean, a whole family in Kentucky. And the order had said to her, if you would like to retire back at what they call the mother house, like, of course you can do that. And so it was completely her choice. She did go back and she saw everyone. She spent some time there. But she purposely decided, okay, once I had done that, she wanted to come back to India because that was where she had spent her entire life, and it was that's where her life was, and she felt like she didn't want to miss the opportunity of basically, ending her life in the place that she had dedicated so much of herself to, and that's what she did. She died in India, and she's buried there.
Writing a work of nonfiction can always be a little fraught because you're writing about real people's lives and you are making interpretive choices about things that have happened in the past. And so I wonder what your mother thought of this book. I wonder what the sisters currently at the convent have thought about the book. What have been the reactions of some of the at least institutions you were writing about been to it?
So my mother is a very interesting, and if you read the book, you'll see sort of independent-minded person. So she definitely had her own ideas about some of my interpretations. That's okay, Although I don't recommend writing about living people. I don't know if I'll ever do that again. But the comment that she often makes, which I think is very revealing, is she still sometimes asks me, she says, is it really, do people really want to read a whole book about this? And I said, yes, Mom, this is really, it's an amazing story. And she says, okay, well, she said, it's just my life. These are just the things that I did. Which, again, that's just my mom. But I think, many of us, that's true, actually, I think for many people. I mean, when you are living through a period of great change, as, we all have really these last couple of years, you don't realize it at the time. You don't imagine I'm living through this incredibly significant event, or the choices that I make as an individual are somehow shaping what people will remember, generations from now. But I mean, frankly, that's what happened. I mean, all the individual choices of the women in the story, they really, in a certain way, shaped the course of history in India, of these places, of these institutions, in a very profound way. So I hope the book captures some of that. And then you asked about the reaction of the sisters. I did have the opportunity a few months ago to go back to the convent. I mean, I've been there a few times, but of course, many of the sisters are quite old now, so I was happy to go there and have an event, something like this in the convent. And I was a little bit nervous about like their reaction to it, because they hadn't, none of them had seen the book before it was published. They were very generous in just saying like, okay, you're the journalist, you're the writer, we trust you to tell the story. But what was really gratifying to me is that even the parts of the book that I think are not so flattering or not easy, definitely, for them to read about the way that some of the young women were treated and how they asked and sometimes demanded that the sisters change. They were actually sort of grateful that someone wrote that story, because they said, we know that there were things that happened that that should have been different, but it's very hard for them to tell that story. So they were happy that someone outside the order was able to both honor their story and honor everything that happened, but also, acknowledge and confront the more difficult parts of that history. So it was really good to hear.
You've already said a little bit about this, but could you say how the hospital that is still in existence is doing today, and there are still nuns from that order who are working and helping to run the hospital?
Oh yes, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. So Nazareth Hospital is still there. It is quite different from what it was. It runs now much more of something like an outpatient clinic. They do sort of basic care, because frankly, that's, again, like that's the thing that's most needed there. I mean, they've been really great innovators over the years in adapting their work to what was needed. I mean, when HIV started in India, I mean, they were among, I mean, in the 80s, really, like they were among the first to do screening. They do hospice work, again, the kind of work that no one else wants to do, because there are other hospitals in the area. When COVID happened in India, of course, like they had not been running an inpatient hospital, but the need was so overwhelming and the community really needed it. So, I mean, they only had one doctor on staff, a sister, who basically worked around the clock for a couple of months dealing with COVID. So but that's their spirit. I mean, that's what they do, and that's what they've always done.
I wonder, Jyoti, exploring something that certainly is very personal to you, what you've learned having written this book and gone through this journey of putting this whole story together. What are some personal insights for you as you've written this book?
Well, I didn't want to write a memoir. I know memoir is a wonderful genre, and that's one way of thinking about a family story. But I don't know, for me, I'm so drawn to history and just to the surprising things that we don't know about the past, that I really wanted to write this more as a work of history, but one that was accessible to a group of, to anyone. But I don't think I anticipated how much I would think about what this meant for myself, I think, because it was really meaningful for me, because I think in writing the story of women from Kentucky, their connection to India, and how it all sort of led back to women from India coming here, it was a way, I think, for me to kind of write myself into American history. I mean, this isn't a story that's very well known. I mean, the partition of India, one might think that, oh, well, that has nothing to do with the United States, but I was so surprised to discover there were American soldiers there. There was American ammunition. I mean, it was a really key part of the World War II effort for the British Army. I mean, all of these things were really connected. So writing this book, in a way, it allowed me to sort of see like, oh yes, actually I am part of this entire story of America being out in the world, and then sort of doing things that eventually cause ripple effects all over the world. So So that was really satisfying for me, and it sort of made me think about my own, very small place in American history in a different way.
It's interesting because there's more and more of us Americans today who have multicultural, multi-ethnic backgrounds. The United States is changing rapidly in that regard. And so I think a book like this, it is fascinating for us all to consider, how our personal stories relate to a greater whole. And, and I think that this is a wonderful journey to sort of not only explore for you personally, but for the reader to consider, as you say, sort of the way American history coincides with history in other parts of the world, because there was so much change going on at that time. I mean, post-World War II, but also with the independence of India. It's remarkable that those young women came from Kentucky into that context with all that change going on with such high ambitions and were able to navigate their way through it, because that was quite a bit of flux for them to deal with. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, anytime you look at the history of a family, or, even the history of an individual, you might see that person, like you see who they are now, but you can't know. I mean, your own family has just a remarkable story. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily know that, from meeting you or talking to you the first time. I mean, I'm guessing most people, when they meet me, don't necessarily know that, like, I have this weird but very profound connection to Kentucky in that way. I mean, I've never lived there, but I think that, so many of us, like, our stories are just way more interesting and complicated than they might appear at first. So I hope, I hope some of you will read this book and maybe think about that, that stash of letters in your attic that, that there's some amazing story there, because I feel like every American family has something like this.
Yeah, we all have threads that we can pull and stories that we can explore that don't just have resonance to us, but, because we're all interrelated, they have resonance to, a much larger context as well, so. Well, we are almost at the time where I would like to begin to open things up and invite questions of Jyoti and from anything that you've heard. We do have, as I understand it, a couple people out in the audience who have microphones at the ready. If you have a question, I invite you to raise your hand and then wait for the microphone to come, and then I invite you to stand. And somebody else who was an interlocutor for another conversation said that a good thing to remember is that whatever you say should end with a question mark. So, yeah.
Good rule of thumb.
Yes, I really enjoyed your book, and I'm curious about the young woman who became the surgeon and sacrificed so much and ended a bit bittersweet, the ending to that story. I wondered, would you please comment a bit more about her and perhaps the order and how they dealt with her leaving the order ultimately? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Dr. Wiss is truly one of the most remarkable women who I've ever come across. I never had a chance to meet her in person, although I did. I'm in close touch with her niece and her other family members. And this is something that really surprised me about that part of the story. Although she was in effect forced to choose between her religious vocation and her vocation as a surgeon, the order, in the end, was very supportive of her decision, and I think the proof of that is that Dr. Wiss herself remained in touch with them, like, throughout her life. I mean, years and years later, and she and her partner actually went to Mokama for the 50th anniversary of the hospital. So I think what that tells me is that as complicated as it was for her, like it was such an important part of her life, it wasn't something that she had, that she wanted to let go of. And I think for the order themselves, I mean, I think they felt constrained by the rules at the time, and I think they also, I think, felt a bit of regret, but a sense that they wanted to do better by the doctors that came later. So it was definitely bittersweet, but I was pleased to see that that she and the order remained in touch later in life.
Felt like I saw another question. Yep.
Yes. I was born in the North Carolina Appalachian Mountains a long, long time ago. And there were only Baptists and Lutherans and a sprinkle of the others there. And it just stunned me when I read that there was this order in Kentucky of Catholics and a whole order of nuns. And I was just wondering how they got there in the first place. I haven't completed the book. I haven't finished the book yet, so you may answer that in there. And the other thing is, in the whole book, you talk about these women as being these really good women who are doing good things, but weren't they really proselytizing and with the idea of conversion? Mm-hmm. And how were they accepted in this place in India who are Muslim or not, or Hindi?
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, that question of proselytizing, it was a difficult thing for them because India at that time, but now as well, but it was very present at the time. This was a country that had just gotten rid of the British. Like, they were not really interested in a bunch of Americans coming and telling them what to do or what to believe. So it was a very uneasy relationship. I mean, they needed people to help build this hospital, and I think they recognized that, and they appreciated the work that they were doing. But again, I think the way that the nuns understood what their mission was, as you asked, I think the way that they would describe it is they felt that their presence, might somehow spark an interest in Catholicism. But I can tell you from reading their letters, they very rarely talked about that as a goal. Like it just wasn't there. And I mean, I assume that they're all, very devout, and that was a certain part of their mission. But, from what I can see, from what they actually talked about with each other, they were really very focused on the hospital and the work itself and just being there and trying to understand the place that they were in. So, I mean, proselytizing, it's not something that they weren't really allowed to do it, and it's just not something that that they did in an open way. Now that first question is an interesting one, and it's one about how the order itself got to Kentucky, and it's one that I had also for myself when I was starting the research. I mean, it's actually such a fascinating story about really some of the very first Catholics who were here in the United States at all. I mean, there were, old Catholic communities in Maryland in particular. So the first Catholics in Kentucky actually came from that area around Baltimore, and they sort of traveled along the Ohio River and settled in Kentucky when, Kentucky was truly the frontier, and in that way that a lot of settlers sort of found themselves in places that did not turn out to be what they thought. It was a group of Catholic families. They kind of stuck together, but they were kind of all on their own in the wilderness. I mean, in a very harsh landscape. It was very, I mean, if you're from any part of Appalachia, it's like many parts of it are very difficult to cultivate. And it was a hard life. And it's so hard for Americans, I think, to understand this now. But at that time, and this was in the, I think, early 1700s, even before independence, some of the first Catholic missionaries were coming from Europe to the frontier of the United States, because that was considered like the sort of wild, unsettled, like that was the wilderness, and that's where you went as a missionary. Missionaries came from Europe to the United States, and so there were these Catholic families who had no priests, so there were missionaries from Belgium and France who settled there, and that's how the order was founded. And they're actually, they call it the Kentucky Holy Lands. There are a couple of monasteries and a few other orders as well. If any of you are familiar with the work of Thomas Merton, like that's that same community.
Well, that question about proselytizing, I mean, I think that goes back to what I said about how I struggled to claim the term missionary, because, I'm not saying that you were implying that in your question, but I do think there is a history of Christians going to parts of the world where they're approaching their missionary work, assuming that the people that they are engaging with are savages and ungodly, people, because they have not accepted Jesus into their heart. And that was certainly not something that I was going to be comfortable with going to Brazil. As far as I was concerned, God was already in Brazil. God was already in the favela that I served in on the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro. So in many respects, I came to see my experience as finding out what God was up to in that place, and trusting that in the decision to cross borders and boundaries like these sisters did, God would be present in the midst of that. There's a saying attributed to St. Francis that I like to quote often that says, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And it feels to me like the sisters were living their lives and carrying out their ministries with that kind of posture in mind.
That's great, yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you so much. I've just started your book, so I'm not very deep into it yet, but I'm curious if in the book you tell how your mother did actually come to the United States.
If the book tells that?
Yes.
It doesn't go into that. Maybe, that's sort of beyond the scope of the book, but it's a little bit in the epilogue, but yeah, like many of her classmates, many of the nursing students, once they became nurses, it just opened up a whole world for them. They, again, did not look back, left the village, went to the big city. I can just tell you my mother's story quickly. This is in the book, that she went to Delhi, one of the biggest cities in India, worked in a hospital, and was unusual for the time. She was a young woman living on her own for a couple of years in a nurse's dormitory. She met my father, sort of love at first sight kind of story, and they got married, they had children, and myself and one of my sisters, and then in 1974, I think it was, the laws in the United States had changed to make it a little bit easier for doctors and nurses to come here. So again, she had already, in a sense, left what she knew twice. So then that opportunity to come to the United States, she took it. And what's interesting is some of her classmates from this nursing school were the ones who she really relied on when she came to the United States, and some of them are still like her best friends today. So.
Other questions right here?
I just wondered, I grew up in the Boston area, and was Protestant, and looking at majority of Catholics in the area that I lived, and we would go to get bread at a convent where they couldn't speak, and so you'd walk into a room and a barrel would turn and you'd put money in and bread would come out. And hearing this story brings me back to that, and I wondered, in your research, are there young women nuns in the U.S. who are thinking of going to India to be missionary, because I don't see them walking around as I did as a girl with their black habits on and, everything. So I wondered, is it a dying industry, so to speak?
Yeah, so, I mean, as inspiring as the story is, and although this order, compared to some other Catholic orders, there are still a few hundred sisters. There are still, some relatively younger ones, particularly in the places where they're working overseas, in India, Belize, Botswana, Nepal. Like, there are younger sisters joining the order, which is unusual. But yeah, it's true. I mean, Catholic religious life is not an appealing thing for most young women in the United States or in other places. So it's sort of dying. But that said, your question about the world of a cloistered nun as opposed to these sisters, that's a real tension, I think, in the book, and I think something that many people don't fully understand about religious life. I mean, you may not see sisters walking around in habits, but they may actually be in your community. They just wear regular clothes, so we don't always know. I mean, many sisters, and this order for sure, they're quite active. Like, they're doing different things in schools, hospitals, running universities, that kind of thing. But that tension, I think, between the, being in a convent and praying and being out in the world is a tension that's very present in the book, in the story as well. And I don't want to give it away, but actually one of the women who started this mission, she really felt that conflict, and it was something that at the end of her, not the end of her life, but at the end of the story, there was actually a split in this order where some of them decided to reject all the changes of Vatican II and formed a kind of offshoot of a religious order that is cloistered. And in fact, I've visited that order as well, because they had some of the records. And although they're a cloistered order and they have a very different idea of what it means to be a religious person, they're also actually quite proud of the work that they did in India. So I was actually pleasantly surprised to find that they were very open to talking to me. You can actually email the Mother Superior of a cloistered order, I discovered in this, and she will write you back. So that was nice to find out.
That's great. It looks like we're just about at time.
Thank you, Jyoti. Jyoti, thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. You can now walk out there, and Jyoti will be signing books. Thank you for coming.